A poor mother took her son to school every day after her night shift. Years later, the son returned as a businessman and told her that the first rays of sunlight timidly peek over the horizon, illuminating the narrow streets of a neighborhood that awakens with its own life. The walls of the buildings, worn by years and the elements, are marked by murals that tell stories of struggle, dreams, and promises. The bustle of the first vendors preparing their stands in the market mixes with the crunch of the delivery bicycles and the laughter of children running barefoot, dodging puddles and playing between the shadows and light of the morning. Elaine walks quickly, holding the hand of Mason, her 10-year-old son, a boy with large, curious eyes. The dark circles under Elaine's eyes are a testament to the long days and sleepless nights that keep her on the edge of exhaustion. But in her gaze, there is still a spark of unbreakable determination. Her hair, tied in a simple bun, sways with each purposeful step. Mason, with his worn-out backpack and notebook sticking out of it, tries to keep up while observing the world around him with a mixture of wonder and longing. The streets they walk are full of stories, from the vendors exchanging greetings and haggling prices to the grandmothers sweeping the sidewalks and murmuring the latest news. Larry, the mechanic with large hands and weathered skin from oil, looks up from his old car as they pass. His greeting is brief but sincere, with a smile that seems to say, "I know what it is to fight every day." Beside him, Sandra, his wife and former teacher, watches from the workshop door, her gaze filled with affection and concern. Though she left the classrooms, her heart remains tied to the children of the neighborhood, to whom she still advises and helps in her free afternoons. Elaine and Mason arrive at the school, a modest building with cracks in the walls and windows that creak when opened, but it also has murals painted by the students themselves, murals full of color and hope. Margot, the young teacher who arrived just 2 years ago but has already won the love and respect of all, waits at the entrance, keeping an eye on how her students arrive one by one. Her face lights up when she sees Mason, a boy she has noticed for his exceptional skill and passion for drawing and inventions. "Good morning, Mason," exclaims Margot with a warm smile as she watches the boy sit at his desk in the front row and begin unfolding his notebooks filled with sketches of machines and complicated diagrams. Elaine approaches and kisses her son on the forehead, whispering words of encouragement. "Today will be a good day, little one. Do your best," she says, her voice masking her own fatigue and the worries that plague her. Mason looks at her, nodding with a mix of enthusiasm and responsibility. She watches as her son enters the school, and for a moment, the fatigue on her face is mixed with a quiet pride. When Mason's figure disappears down the hallway, Elaine turns and begins walking toward the factory, a place that represents both her livelihood and her nightmares. Along the way, the neighborhood streets are filled with more familiar faces. Some smile, others look at her with a mix of respect and compassion. Elaine, without stopping, feels the weight of responsibility in her chest, but also the firmness of someone who has promised not to give up. The rhythmic sound of sewing machines and the roar of presses fill the air in the factory. The flickering and worn fluorescent lights barely illuminate the wide, gloomy space where dozens of workers move to the beat of the foreman's orders and whistles. Elaine, with a tense back and agile fingers, operates the machine in front of her, spitting fabric after fabric. Each stitch is a part of the life she is fighting to maintain, each movement a silent dance of resistance. Roberto, the foreman, a tall man with a sharp gaze and a cynical smile, walks through the aisles with his arms crossed. His presence is a constant reminder of the tension in the atmosphere. The workers glance at him sideways, avoiding his eyes, knowing that a single mistake could cost them more than a reprimand. In the distance, Finn, the factory owner, walks in silence, his imposing posture and distant expression. His visits are always brief, but leave a trail of unease in everyone who sees him. Elaine finishes a batch of stitches and takes a moment to wipe her forehead with the back of her hand. A movement in the corner of the room catches her attention. Roberto is watching her, and in his eyes reflects something more than the usual severity. There is a flash of calculated intention. Before she can wonder why, her name echoes over the intercom. Elaine Gomez, to the foreman's office now. The room's murmur stops for a second, and her co-worker's eyes briefly meet hers, filled with concern and questions. She walks toward the office with her heart pounding in her chest, her steps echoing on the concrete floor like a reflection of her thoughts. As she crosses the threshold, the door closes with a sharp snap behind her. Roberto, with a false gesture of kindness, motions for her to sit. On the desk, there is an open folder and several papers scattered around. Roberto's gaze locks onto her, cold and accusatory. Elaine, we've discovered that materials are missing. Some high-quality parts and fabrics have disappeared from the inventory, he says in a voice that sounds more like a sentence than an accusation. And according to the records, you were the last one to access that section. Elaine freezes for a moment. Disbelief paints an expression on her face that quickly turns into a mix of fear and suppressed anger. That's impossible. I never... She tries to reply, but Roberto raises a hand to silence her. The evidence is here, he insists, pointing to the papers as if they were irrefutable proof. And Mr. Finn has been informed. Elaine feels the weight of injustice crushing her chest. She looks at the door, as if someone could enter at any moment to help her. But the office is locked, and Roberto watches her with a smile that no longer hides his triumph. At that moment, the door opens, and Finn enters. The seriousness on his face leaves no room for questions or doubts. He looks at Elaine briefly, as if searching for something in her gaze, but not really wanting to find it. Elaine, I cannot tolerate such acts in my factory, he says, in a voice that pretends to be impartial, but is laden with haste and weariness. You are dismissed, effective immediately. Elaine feels her world crumble. The words echo in her head like an endless sound, each syllable a stone falling and sinking within her. She wants to protest, explain, defend herself, but the words get stuck in her throat. With a mix of disbelief and despair, she grabs her things and leaves the office under the inquisitive and compassionate gazes of her co-workers, who murmur among themselves, aware that none of them are safe from such injustice. When Elaine exits the factory, the daylight seems brighter and crueler. She walks down the street with a foggy mind and trembling body, wondering what she will tell Mason, what will become of them now. The streets of the neighborhood, which had seemed full of life and promise that morning, now feel cold and distant, watching her in silence, suffocating her. Meanwhile, Roberto, in his office, watches from the window as Elaine walks away. A barely perceptible smile curves his lips. Outside, Finn stands still for a moment, not looking at anyone, just staring at the sky, which is turning an uncertain grey, unable to admit that in his hasty decision, he might have made a mistake. The first morning light bathes the neighborhood in a soft glow, but for Elaine, the new day brings the weight of uncertainty. The echo of the farewell words at the factory still rings in her head as she walks the streets, looking for a temporary job that can relieve, even if just a little, the pressure on her shoulders. The familiar faces of the market vendors reflect a mix of compassion and resignation as they watch her pass. Elaine, head held high but eyes tired, approaches several stands, offering her help to carry boxes, clean, or do any task that would earn her a bit of money. The responses are polite but evasive, and her hope begins to falter. Meanwhile, at school, Mason is sitting at his desk, completely unaware of the new reality his mother is facing. Margot, the young teacher, watches him carefully as he sketches complex diagrams of machines in his notebook, his concentration so deep that the noise of the class seems not to affect him. Margot sees in those lines not only the talent of a curious child, but the promise of someone who could break the cycle of hardship surrounding the neighborhood. The bell rings, and Mason packs his things, feeling the rush to get home and tell his mother what happened that day. As Mason exits, he is greeted by Ryan, a young man from the neighborhood with an ambiguous reputation. Ryan approaches the boy with a sly smile and a gesture of complicity. "What's up, champ? How's school going?" he asks, while pulling out a cigarette and lighting it. Mason has always been intrigued by Ryan. He knows that adults view him with suspicion, but there is something in him, a kindness hidden beneath his rebellious facade. "Good, Ryan. Today they told me I'm going to the science contest in the city. Margot says it's important," Mason responds, with a spark of excitement in his eyes. Ryan falls silent for a moment, the smile fading, and a flash of nostalgia crosses his gaze. "That's incredible, Mason. You have to win. Not just for you, but for all of us," he finally says, giving him a pat on the back. But the joy in his words fades when he sees Jonas, the leader of the neighborhood gang, watching from the corner with his sharp eyes and a barely perceptible look of approval. Jonas approaches, his imposing presence darkening the mood. "Ryan, we need to talk," he says in a firm, low voice. The young man nods, his expression hardening, and with one last glance at Mason, he walks away with Jonas down an alley, leaving the boy with a feeling of unease in his stomach. Back at home, Elaine returns after a fruitless day of job hunting, her hands empty and her heart heavy. She tries to smile when she sees Mason, but he immediately notices the sadness in his mother's eyes. They sit together at the kitchen table, and while Mason excitedly tells her about the science contest, Elaine listens, trying to hide the tears that threaten to fall. To Mason, his mother has always been a symbol of strength, and although her voice trembles, she promises him that everything will be okay. At night, when the neighborhood sinks into a silence interrupted only by the distant murmur of conversations and the occasional bark of a dog, Elaine sits in the small living room and meets with Brianna, the lawyer with a firm yet understanding gaze who had stopped by Larry's workshop. Brianna listens to Elaine's story, and although her face remains impassive, her eyes reflect a flash of indignation. "You don't have to accept this, Elaine. You can fight it," she says, planting the first seed of hope in the woman's mind. That night, while Mason sleeps, dreaming of inventions and triumphs, Elaine watches the moon through the window, her heart torn between uncertainty and the small flame of hope that Brianna had ignited within her. On the other side of the neighborhood, Ryan sits on the roof of his house, elbows on his knees, lost in thought. He hears Jonas's voice echoing in his mind, reminding him of promises of power and quick money. But he also remembers Mason's words, full of dreams and possibilities, and feels a pang of guilt. The day begins with a clouded sky that foretells a storm, and the neighborhood, always in motion, seems quieter than usual. Elaine, now carrying the weight of injustice on her shoulders, walks toward Larry's workshop, where Sandra waits with a hot cup of tea and a concerned look. Larry, with oil-stained hands and a furrowed brow, approaches them and sits on a wooden stool. The news of Elaine's dismissal has already reached his ears, and his expression shows solidarity and contained anger. "Something doesn't add up, Elaine. In the last few weeks, I've noticed that parts and materials are missing from the factory. There are rumors that they're being sold on the black market, and everything points to someone covering their tracks very well," says Larry, as he presses his lips together and lightly bangs his fist on the bench. Elaine, who had suspected that something deeper was behind Roberto's accusation, feels her indignation turn into determination. Sandra, who had always been more observant than she seemed, intervenes with her soft but firm voice. "This isn't just an attack on you, Elaine. It's a symptom of something much bigger that's affecting the whole neighborhood." Meanwhile, at school, Mason continues to immerse himself in his studies and preparations for the science contest. However, a lingering unease accompanies him. The whispered conversations among the teachers and the concerned looks from Margot tell him that something is wrong at home. After class, Margot approaches him with a forced smile. "Mason, is everything okay at home?" she asks with a voice full of genuine concern. The boy hesitates for a second before responding. "My mum's been a little sad, but she always says everything will be okay," he confesses. Margot feels a pang in her heart, understanding that Elaine's troubles are affecting more than the boy admits. In another corner of the neighborhood, Ryan walks with heavy steps, the shadow of Jonas always present in the alleys he passes through. He stops for a moment, looking at the graffiti covering the walls, images of wrestlers, mothers with their children, and dreams painted in faded colors. Jonas's words echo in his mind, urging him to join a new and dangerous plan that involves hitting the factory. However, the image of Mason, with his enthusiasm and dreams of becoming an engineer, makes him doubt in a way he never has before. Ryan meets Mason on his way home, and the boy, with his innocent smile, tells him about his projects and the upcoming contest. Ryan, who used to see the world as a game of survival, finds himself torn. "Hey, Mason, don't let anyone tell you that you can't achieve what you want," he says, more to himself than to the boy. Mason looks at him surprised and nods, not fully understanding the depth of those words. Carter, on the other hand, visits the school on his father's behalf to deliver donations and documents. Margot greets him, and in an unusual gesture, Carter stays longer than necessary, looking at the walls covered with murals and photos of the students. His eyes fall on a drawing by Mason, a sketch of a futuristic bridge, and a sad smile appears on his face. Margot notices his change in expression and asks, "What's bothering you, Carter?" "My father," he replies after a silence, needing no further explanation. They exchange a look that transcends words, a tacit agreement that the neighborhood and its people deserve something better than indifference and corruption. As evening falls, while the rain starts to hit the tin roofs and the streets turn into rivers of water and reflections, Elaine arrives home to find Mason reviewing some old documents that Sandra had lent him. Among them, there are yellowed papers with notes and drawings by Finn's late wife, a woman whose story seemed forgotten. Mason shows her one of the papers, pointing to handwritten words that read, "For the neighborhood to grow, we must grow together." Elaine sits beside him, and for a moment, the weight on her chest lightens. She strokes her son's hair, grateful for the spark of hope he represents, while outside, the streetlights turn on and the rain continues to fall, cleansing the streets of a neighborhood that, unknowingly, is preparing to face its greatest challenge. The dawn over the neighborhood brings a sky stained with shades of gray and blue. A cool breeze sweeps through the streets, moving fallen leaves and fluttering the colorful banners hanging between the posts. Elaine wakes up early, her thoughts tangled in the conversation she had with Brianna the night before. The idea of fighting against injustice seems at once crazy and like the only possible option. With her heart pounding and her fingers tense, she prepares a weak coffee while looking at Mason, still asleep, curled up among his notebooks and drawings. The light of the day begins to flood the house, and Mason wakes up with a mixture of sleep and excitement. He remembers that the science contest is soon, an event Margot had described as a unique opportunity to showcase his talent. However, the tension in the air and the shadows in his mother's eyes tell him that something isn't right. When Elaine looks at him, she smiles with a sweetness that hides her fears, kissing him on the forehead before he leaves for school. The path to school is full of life, vendors dusting off their goods, children running through the streets, and a group of elderly people chatting on the corner. But Mason can't help but notice that the adults' looks are darker than usual, as if an invisible cloud hangs over the neighborhood. When he arrives at school, Margot greets him with a wide smile and hands him some contest brochures. "You need to prepare well, Mason. This is your moment," she says, trying to make her enthusiasm a balm for the doubts she sees in the boy's eyes. Meanwhile, at the factory, Finn is reviewing some documents in his office. The news of missing materials and the growing suspicion of corruption has left him uneasy, although he prefers to focus on other matters, avoiding confronting what it might imply. In the hallway, Roberto passes with an air of self-satisfaction, overseeing the workers who, heads down, move to the rhythm of the machines. Larry, from his workshop, watches the ebb and flow of activities and wonders how much longer they can ignore what's happening. The parts he once obtained easily have begun to scarce, and the rumors about the black market are becoming more persistent. He decided he couldn't sit idly by. That afternoon, he spoke with Sandra and shared his suspicions. Roberto must be behind all this, Sandra, and if what they say about Jonas and his gang is true, things are going to get worse. Sandra, who still maintained her teacher's composure, nodded seriously. We can't let the neighborhood fall into the hands of people like them. Elaine needs our support, and the kids like Mason deserve a better place. Elaine, meanwhile, spent the afternoon meeting with Brianna at a makeshift cafe in Sandra's house. The lawyer laid out some papers on the table showing documents she had gathered about the suspicious activities at the factory. These are inventory records that don't match, and some testimonies from former workers who talk about theft and account manipulation. Roberto has been diverting materials for months, Brianna explained, her eyes gleaming with a mix of rage and determination. Elaine leaned over the documents, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages. The certainty of the corruption she had suspected materialized before her eyes. But how will we prove it to Finn? He won't listen to someone like me, she said, her voice cracking. We won't do it alone, Brianna responded, offering a smile that tried to give her courage. Larry and Sandra are already on our side, and there are others in the neighborhood who, though they fear speaking out, know what's going on. At the school, Carter was helping Margot organize an event to raise funds. Though his initial intentions had been merely to please his father, each passing day at school made him feel more connected to the neighborhood and the problems of the people who lived there. Margot, having noticed the change in him, looked at him while they set up chairs in the classroom. It seems like you're starting to understand why this is so important to us, she said with a soft smile. Carter looked at her, surprised by the frankness in her tone, and nodded. There's a lot my father doesn't see, Margot, and a lot I didn't see, until now. The echo of his words resonated in Margot, who moved closer to him, feeling a connection that transcended class differences and privilege. If you want to help, there are things you need to know, she said. And so, for the next few hours, she told him about the history of the factory and the legacy of Finn's wife, a woman who had fought for the well-being of the neighborhood and whose dream had been lost amidst unchecked ambition. As night fell, Ryan found himself in a dark corner of the neighborhood, head lowered, hands in his pockets. Jonas, with his dominant presence and deep voice, was giving instructions for the attack they were planning on the factory. This is what we need, Ryan. One move, and we'll have what we've always wanted, he said, with a tone that left no room for doubt. Ryan nodded, but inside, a battle was raging. He thought of Mason and the words he had said about fighting for his dreams. He remembered Elaine's gaze, always kind, always strong, and a sharp pain stabbed his chest. In a moment of silence, he lifted his head and met Jonas's fixed gaze. Don't ruin it, Ryan. There's no turning back, Jonas declared, before disappearing into the shadows. At home, Mason was reviewing the old documents Sandra had lent him. He had found more writings from Finn's wife, blueprints for a community center project, and notes on how the factory could serve as a driving force for progress for everyone. Every word filled him with questions, and more importantly, with an urgency he could not ignore. When Elaine saw him, she felt a warm pride mixed with constant concern. "What have you found, son?" she asked, sitting beside him. "She wanted the factory to help the neighborhood, Mom. She wanted everyone to have opportunities," Mason replied, pointing to a paragraph underlined with faded ink. Elaine hugged him, feeling hope begin to sprout again within her, but also aware of the dangers lurking. Night advanced, and the streets of the neighborhood sank into a tense calm. In the warehouse where they met, Jonas and Roberto were discussing the final details of their plan. "When the factory burns, Finn will be the one to blame, and we'll take what's ours," Roberto said, his voice filled with resentment that had been building for years. Jonas nodded, with the certainty of a predator on the hunt. But in the shadows, Ryan listened, feeling that every word was another nail in the coffin of his conscience. He knew he was at a crossroads, and his decision would not only define his fate, but the fate of the entire neighborhood. Night fell over the neighborhood like a heavy cloak, filled with omens and silences that seemed to speak louder than words. The streets, usually full of laughter and murmurs, felt restless. The lights flickered intermittently, and the shadows stretched long and trembling over brick walls and faded murals that told stories of struggle. Elaine, in her small home, felt the air thick and charged with electricity, as if the world were on the verge of changing. Mason, unaware of the storm approaching, was focused on his desk, going over the final details of his project for the science contest. His eyes reflected determination, but also a shadow of worry that had become common since his mother lost her job. Elaine watched him from the door, and for a moment, the mixture of fear and pride in her chest became almost unbearable. But she said nothing. She simply approached, stroked his hair and whispered, "I'm so proud of you, my love." In another corner of the neighborhood, Ryan walked with a firm step, but inside, he was at war. Jonas's voice still echoed in his mind. "Don't forget, Ryan, everything depends on tonight." The promise of power, of money, of a future that didn't require begging for scraps, was tempting. But the image of Mason, with his big eyes full of dreams, haunted him. The murmurs of children playing on the corners and the muffled laughter of nighttime conversations reminded him of what was at stake. He knew the decision he made tonight could change everything. Jonas and his gang were already moving like shadows through the alleys, carrying cans of gasoline and lighters. The men's faces were hard, marked by years of surviving in a world that offered them nothing but a path of violence and betrayal. Roberto waited in the gloom, his expression anxious and his gaze restless. He knew that once the fire started, there would be no turning back. The flames would erase the evidence, and if they were lucky, Finn would carry the blame, leaving him as the misunderstood hero. At Margot's house, Carter appeared unexpectedly. His face was marked by worry, and without preamble, he entered and said, "I've heard something at the factory. There are rumors something's going to happen tonight. Margot, if what I suspect is true, we need to do something." Margot was silent for a moment, processing the gravity of what Carter had just said. With no time to waste, they both decided to head to the neighborhood to warn whoever they could and prevent a tragedy. Carter, with trembling hands, took his phone and sent messages to some contacts who might help alert the authorities. Meanwhile, Mason, drawn by a flash of lights at the factory, sneaked out of his house without Elaine noticing. He took with him one of the old papers he had found about Finn's wife, as if he needed to understand something more about her and the place that had once been a symbol of promise for the neighborhood. Upon reaching the factory, the boy hid behind some old boxes and observed how figures moved in the darkness. Among the shadows, he recognized Ryan, who seemed torn between moving or staying rooted to the spot. "Ryan, do it already," ordered Jonas, impatient, as one of his men unscrewed a can of gasoline and began spraying the corners of the main building. The acrid smell mixed with the night's dampness and the crunch of footsteps on the debris of wood and metal became more intense. Roberto moved nervously, casting quick glances around. For a moment, his eyes met Ryan's, and something in the young man's expression made him hesitate. Mason, crouching and trembling, suddenly understood the magnitude of what was about to happen. He felt trapped between fear and the urgency to do something. His sweaty hands gripped the paper, and his breath quickened. Suddenly, a soft yet determined voice was heard near him. "Mason, what are you doing here?" Margot, who had arrived with Carter, looked at him with concern. Carter, who had entered behind her, stared at the scene with horror as he saw the first flames begin to climb the walls. Chaos erupted in an instant. "We need to get everyone out of here now," Carter shouted, rushing inside to warn the workers who were still cleaning and organizing the place. Ryan, seeing Mason and Margot, felt a blow to his chest and charged at the group of men who were starting more fires. "Don't do it!" he shouted, pushing one of them and knocking over a can of gasoline. Jonas glared at him, his eyes narrowed with restrained fury. "Betrayal, Ryan. I didn't think you'd be so stupid," he said, and without another word, he pulled out a knife. But before he could move, an explosion at one of the corners of the factory shook the ground and enveloped everyone in a cloud of smoke and flames. Roberto, seeing everything crumble, tried to escape, but he stumbled and was trapped under a beam that fell in front of him. The heat became unbearable, and everyone's vision was filled with the orange and red glow that threatened to consume everything. Margot, with her eyes irritated by the smoke, grabbed Mason's hand and guided him toward an exit. "Carter, we need help here," she shouted as she struggled to stay on her feet. Carter, gasping and coughing, saw his father Finn appear at the factory entrance, his face pale and his eyes filled with a mix of horror and guilt. Finn moved slowly, as if time had stopped, while he watched the hell that had once been his pride. Margot's voice pulled him from his trance. "Finn, there are people inside. Help us." Without thinking twice, he ran toward the group of workers who were trying to push open a jammed door, while the flames came closer. In the midst of the chaos, Ryan saw Jonas disappear into the shadows, and with one last look of defiance, he ran toward Mason and Margot to help them escape. Just as he succeeded, a nearby explosion threw him to the ground, striking him with debris and leaving him seriously wounded. The sound of sirens broke the night, and firefighters arrived in a sea of red and blue lights. Larry and Sandra, alerted by the screams and flames, reached the scene and saw Finn helping Carter, covered in soot, out of the factory. The image of Roberto, trapped under the beam, reminded them that greed and ambition always come at a cost. Brianna, who had arrived with Elaine and other neighbors, watched as the firefighters fought to control the flames. Roberto was pulled out by the firefighters, handcuffed and shouting in agony, while Brianna, holding evidence in her hand, looked at Finn. "This is bigger than it seems, and you know it," she said, her voice resonating over the crackling fire. Finn, standing amidst the devastation, felt the weight of his decisions and omissions crash down on him like a wave. The letter from his wife, which Margot handed him at that moment, seemed to weigh more than any other paper in his hands. The words written, reminding him of promises and dreams they once shared, left him speechless. Ryan, in Larry's arms, opened his eyes for a moment and met Mason's gaze. A weak smile crossed his face as he whispered, "We did it, kid. We saved what matters." Mason, with tears in his eyes, nodded, understanding that his friend, the young man who had fought his shadow, had made the right decision in the end. The dawn that followed the fire came slowly, tinting the sky a soft amber color that barely managed to disperse the smell of ash that enveloped the neighborhood. The factory, now a smoldering ruin, stood as a monument to pain and redemption, a reminder of how unchecked ambition and desperation can collide in tragedy. The air was filled with murmurs and hurried footsteps. The neighbors gathered around the destroyed building, some still in pajamas, others with faces marked by the exhaustion and fear of the previous night. Elaine arrived at the scene, holding Mason's hand, the boy's eyes still swollen from tears. In the distance, she saw Larry and Sandra by an ambulance, and on a stretcher, Ryan, with bandages covering his wounds, breathing with difficulty. Despite his condition, there was a peace on his face that he had never shown before. Larry, with a broken voice, whispered words of encouragement to him, while Sandra stroked his arm, trying to hold back tears. "He was brave, Elaine," Larry said as she approached. "He did the right thing." Mason pulls his hand away from his mother's and runs towards Ryan. His eyes, full of gratitude and fear, meet those of his friend, who gives him a weak but sincere smile. "You have to win that contest, Mason," Ryan murmurs with effort. "Do it for all of us." Mason nods, unable to speak, as tears run down his cheeks. Meanwhile, Finn stands in a corner, observing everything with slumped shoulders and a lost gaze. The letter from his wife, still clutched in his hand, feels like a sentence and a broken promise. Margot approaches him, her face smeared with soot and her voice trembling. You know what this means, right? There's no more time for excuses, she says, her tone a mix of pain and defiance. Finn listens, but doesn't respond. In his mind, the weight of past decisions piles up, forming a barrier that threatens to crush him. The presence of Carter, who approaches limping with a wound on his brow, forces him to confront reality. Father, all this, the suffering of these people, it's no longer just about you or me. It's about them, Carter says, gesturing to the workers, the neighbors, and the children watching with expectant eyes. The bustling crowd momentarily quiets when Brianna appears with a couple of officers holding up the documents she had gathered. Roberto, still handcuffed and with a defeated expression, is brought into the center of attention. I confess, he murmurs through clenched teeth, his eyes sunken with shame. I orchestrated the theft, diverted the materials. But I didn't plan this. Jonas, he forced me to go further. A whisper runs through the crowd, a mix of surprise and confirmation. Brianna steps forward and, with a firm voice, exposes the web of corruption that had been woven right under everyone's noses. This factory wasn't just being plundered. It was a symbol of greed and indifference, but no more. Finn, you can do something different, and you know you must, she concludes, her eyes demanding justice. Finn, in a move that surprises everyone, kneels amidst the rubble and nods, finally breaking the barrier that kept him distant. I will. I'll do what I should have done from the beginning, he says, his voice breaking. The letter from his wife slips from his fingers and falls to the ground, marked by dust and tears. Elaine feels a lump in her throat at the sight of the redemption of a man who, though he had caused so much harm, now showed signs of change. She approaches Finn and, with an unexpected gesture, offers him her hand. It's time to rebuild. Not just this factory, but everything that was lost along the way, she says, her voice trembling but filled with determination. Finn looks at her, surprised, and nods, accepting the hand that represents not only forgiveness, but a shared commitment. The following days are filled with activity. The neighbors, united by tragedy and hope, begin clearing the remnants of the factory, with Finn working side by side with them. Carter organizes a fundraiser and events to kickstart the rebuilding, while Brianna, with her unrelenting ethics, ensures that the legal processes against Roberto and Jonas's gang progress quickly. Jonas, who had managed to escape the night of the fire, is being pursued by the police, and the news of his escape adds more tension to the air. Ryan, meanwhile, struggles to recover in the hospital. Every day, Mason visits him after school, bringing drawings and telling stories that keep Ryan connected to the life that awaits him. Larry and Sandra are always nearby, taking care of him as if he were their own son. Over time, the young man begins to improve, and though the scars on his body and soul won't fade easily, his gaze reflects a peace he had never known before. Elaine, with Brianna's support, takes her case to the labor authorities, and thanks to the evidence presented and Roberto's confession, the theft accusation is overturned, clearing her name. The news spreads through the neighborhood like a whisper of relief and celebration. The woman who had been falsely accused becomes a symbol of resistance, inspiring others to raise their voices and demand what is right. One afternoon, as the sun tinges the sky with oranges and purples, Finn calls for a meeting at the center of the neighborhood. The neighbors gather, some still skeptical, others with latent hope. Finn speaks, his voice clear and stronger than it had been in years. I have failed all of you, and I know it. But I promise that what comes from here on out will be different. This factory will be rebuilt, not as a symbol of power, but as a center of opportunity for everyone. The silence that follows is dense, until a solitary applause, that of Carter, is heard. Slowly, more applause joins in, and the air fills with a mixture of approval and expectation. Margot, from the crowd, smiles at Carter, sharing a moment of pride that transcends words. The chapter concludes with Mason, sitting next to Ryan in the hospital, showing him his completed project. Look, Ryan. It's a prototype of a machine that could help people lift debris more easily. I want them to see it at the contest, he says, his gaze full of hope. Ryan, still weak but with a smile on his lips, nods. That's it, Mason. Keep dreaming and building. We'll make sure the neighborhood never stops fighting. The sun sets, bathing the neighborhood in a warm golden light that seems to promise a new beginning. The factory, now surrounded by rubble and tools, waits to be rebuilt, not just in stone and metal, but in the heart of a community that has decided to be reborn together, with sacrifices, redemptions, and a shared will to create a better future. The first light of day touches the streets of the neighborhood, casting golden glimmers at the corners and on the broken glass of the still-smoking factory. The silence is heavy, broken only by the murmur of the neighbors who have gathered to witness the ruins. The previous night had changed everyone's course, and the promise of a new dawn carried with it a mix of pain and hope. Elaine walks slowly toward the site, arms crossed, head held high. Around her, people exchange looks, some filled with curiosity, others with admiration. When she arrives at the factory, she sees Finn standing among the rubble, the letter from his wife still in hand, his eyes fixed on what was once his pride and now is nothing more than ashes. By his side, Carter watches silently, supporting his father with a mix of firmness and compassion. Finn, Elaine begins, breaking the silence. Her voice is soft but sure. I know this isn't easy, but change never is. He looks at her, his eyes tired and full of regret. For a moment, he seems about to say something, but Carter speaks first. Father, it's time to stop looking at the past with lament and start rebuilding. Not for us, but for them, Carter says, pointing to the neighbors watching them expectantly. Finn nods slowly and steps forward. What began as a symbol of power became a burden, and that's why what comes from now on will be different, Finn declares, his voice, though broken, trying to project resolve. This factory will rise again, not as an extension of my name, but as a place of opportunities for all. The words fall on the crowd like a spark, igniting murmurs of approval and nods. The distrust still felt is palpable, but so is the possibility of a new beginning. Margot, who has been standing with Larry and Sandra, feels a sense of relief run through her chest. She looks at Carter and smiles, knowing that this is the first step on a long journey. Brianna steps forward, holding the documents and a look of determination. Finn, if this is going to work, there are conditions. This time, it won't be a broken promise. We'll work together, with transparency, and the community will have a voice, she says, her words as sharp as her gaze. Finn nods without hesitation. It's the least we can do, he responds, and the neighbors murmur their approval of the declaration. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Ryan wakes up, feeling the warmth of the sunlight on his face. Larry, who had spent the night by his side, smiles wearily. You're missing all the action out there, kid, he jokes, and Ryan lets out a weak laugh that ends in a pained grimace. Despite the injuries, there's something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a glimmer of hope, a desire to make things right. Mason enters the room with his drawing pad and a wide grin. Ryan, you've got to see this, he says excitedly as he unfolds the pages filled with diagrams and sketches. Larry watches the interaction between the two and feels his heart fill with pride and relief. Ryan, though still pale, looks at the drawings and nods, as if in each stroke he sees a piece of the future he had once feared he wouldn't have. Elaine arrives shortly afterward, accompanied by Sandra. She approaches Ryan and takes his hand with a tenderness that makes his chin tremble. Thank you, she simply says, and Ryan, who has never felt such weight in a single word, responds with a light squeeze and a smile. Back at the factory, the first efforts of reconstruction begin. The neighbors, led by Larry and other veteran workers, clear debris and organize donated materials. Margot and Carter, for their part, organize a fundraiser to gather funds and resources. Donations start arriving, and the community comes together to support the project. Young and old, parents and children, everyone contributes in some way, whether by working, cooking for the volunteers, or watching the children while their parents help. The atmosphere in the neighborhood transforms from a cautious heaviness to a bustle of hope. Mason, always observant, sees how people who barely spoke to each other now share laughs and stories while rebuilding something greater than just a building. Margot feels overwhelmed with emotion as she witnesses the change, and one afternoon, while organizing materials with Carter, their hands brush. They exchange a glance, and in their eyes, there's a tacit understanding that together they've contributed to something bigger than themselves. Brianna, who never stops working, presents a plan to create a community committee that will oversee the factory's new management. Elaine is chosen to be part of the committee, and the news fills Mason with pride. "Mum, you did it," he says, hugging her tightly. "We did it, son," Elaine responds, her eyes shining with joy. Meanwhile, the police finally track down Jonas, who is captured after a brief confrontation on the outskirts of the neighborhood. The news spreads through the streets, met with a collective sigh of relief. The last trace of the shadow that had threatened the neighborhood fades, leaving space for light. Over time, the factory begins to take shape once again. It becomes a space that not only produces goods, but also hope. Finn, true to his word, attends the committee meetings and works alongside Brianna and the community leaders to ensure that everything is managed fairly. Carter, who has never felt so close to his father, accompanies him to these meetings, learning from his mistakes and committing to walk a different path. Ryan, fully recovered, joins Larry's workshop, where he finds renewed purpose teaching other young people mechanical skills and sharing his story as a testament to redemption. The children, who once viewed him with fear or admiration, now respect him for what he has overcome. Sandra, with a warm smile, watches as he guides a group of teenagers, aware that the neighborhood has gained more than a factory. It has gained an unexpected leader. The chapter concludes with an afternoon when the neighborhood celebrates the laying of the first stone of the new community project. Mason, with his finished science project ready for the contest, is invited to speak. The boy, with his heart pounding in his chest, looks up at the crowd and says, "My mom always told me that dreams aren't just for one, but for all. Today, I want this place to be the dream of all of us." The applause echoes in the air, and Elaine, with tears in her eyes, watches him, knowing that all the sacrifice, struggle, and pain have been worth it. The sun sets, leaving behind a sky painted with warm colors, as the neighborhood, more united and resilient than ever, looks toward a future they have decided to build, brick by brick, heart by heart. The first ray of light falling on the neighborhood in the morning of the reconstruction feels different, brighter, warmer. The echoes of the fire and the chaos that followed have begun to dissipate, and in their place, the sound of hammers, saws, and laughter begins to fill the streets. The factory, once a reminder of oppression and misguided power, now stands as a symbol of possibility, with scaffolding and workers moving like a swarm, each playing a part in the new story of the neighborhood. Elaine, wearing a work shirt with dust-covered hands, walks among the volunteers, overseeing the work of the day. By her side, Larry, with his characteristic scarf around his forehead, gives instructions and adjusts the ropes holding the materials. Sandra, ever present, distributes water and snacks to the workers, sharing words of encouragement that bring smiles and gratitude. "Today isn't just another workday. It's a step towards a better future," says Sandra, and everyone nods, knowing that every small gesture contributes to the change. Mason moves among the workers, handing out tools and asking if he can help. His eyes shine with a mix of excitement and pride as he watches his mother at the center of it all, leading with the same determination that has inspired him all his life. Margot and Carter arrive with a truck full of donations, wood, cans of paint, and boxes of tools the community has gathered in recent days. "Let's go. There's a lot to do," Carter exclaims, and his voice rings out like a spark that ignites the others. Finn, who has kept himself out of the public eye since the night of the fire, watches from a corner, his hands in his pockets and his brow furrowed with a mix of regret and determination. He knows he has a long road ahead to earn his people's trust, but today he has decided to take the first step. He approaches Elaine and Larry, who stop for a moment when they see him. "I want to help," he says simply, his voice cracked but sincere. Elaine nods without saying anything, and Larry, after a second of hesitation, hands him a hammer. "Welcome, Finn," he says, and a murmur of surprise spreads among the workers as they see the former owner join the labor. The atmosphere in the neighborhood gradually transforms. What once were murmurs of suspicion turn into animated conversations, laughter, and even songs rising into the clear sky. Margot organizes activities for the children, who paint murals on the outside walls with messages of hope and figures representing the unity of the neighborhood. Mason, with his artistic talent, leads a group of younger children, patiently explaining how to mix the colors to create the perfect mural. In the center of the painting, a reborn factory emerges from flowers and trees, with figures of people united around it. Amidst all the work, Carter takes a moment to look at Margot, his partner in this unexpected struggle. "I never imagined this would be part of my life," he says, with a smile full of gratitude and admiration. Margot smiles back, her eyes bright with emotion. "The best paths are the ones we never plan for, Carter," she replies, lightly touching his arm. As the day progresses and the sun reaches its highest point, Brianna calls a meeting with the members of the community committee in one of the empty classrooms at the school. The table is filled with plans, documents, and a list of tasks. Elaine, now an active member of the committee, sits beside Finn, who reviews the papers seriously. "This isn't just a physical reconstruction," Brianna begins, her voice clear and firm. "It's a pact to ensure that what happened never happens again, so that power is distributed and the community will decide its own destiny." Finn nods, and for the first time in a long while, his gaze reflects something more than fatigue, a glimpse of hope. "I'm ready to do it right," he says, and his voice, though soft, is sincere. Carter, sitting beside him, places a hand on his shoulder. "We're all ready, Father," he assures him, marking a moment of reconciliation that does not go unnoticed by the others. Days turn into weeks, and the factory begins to take shape again. This time, with a more open structure, large windows allowing natural light to come in, and a space dedicated to community workshops. Larry, with the help of Ryan, who is now fully recovered and working again, organizes a space to teach mechanics and other skills to the neighborhood youth. "Here, we won't just fix things, we'll build them," says Ryan, his voice resonating with a confidence that inspires those who listen. The young people, who once saw him as a figure to fear or admire for the wrong reasons, now look at him with genuine respect, knowing he has changed and that his story is a lesson in redemption. One afternoon, during one of the community activities, Finn asks for the floor. The crowd falls silent, watching the man who was once a symbol of power and distance. "I've learned that true leadership isn't exercised from above, but from the heart," he begins, his voice barely cracked with emotion. "I promise that this factory, which once represented my pride and selfishness, will now be a symbol of what we can all achieve together. And while I can't erase the past, I can work to ensure the future is different." The applause doesn't take long to follow, first timidly, then louder, until the entire square resonates with an approval that Finn does not dare to accept with complacency, but with humility. Brianna, from the center, smiles slightly, recognizing that promises must be watched, but also that the first step toward real change has been taken. Elaine and Mason watch from the side, and he, with his eyes shining with emotion, takes her hand. "Mom, we did it," he says, and Elaine, with her voice full of contained emotion, replies, "Yes, son, we did it, but this is just the beginning." Ryan, watching from a distance, meets Larry and Sandra's gaze. "You've done the right thing, And that's all that matters, Sandra tells him, hugging him warmly. Ryan, who had fought against the darkness within himself, feels that he has finally found a home and a purpose. Carter and Margot, side by side, began planning a musical and artistic event to celebrate the reopening of the factory. "We didn't just rebuild a building, Carter. We rebuilt hope," Margot says, and he nods, his smile reflecting the pride of contributing to something greater than himself. With the sun setting on the horizon and lights flickering on the neighborhood streets, the sound of hammering and laughter fills the air. The community has gathered not just to rebuild walls, but to forge a new future, one where power lies in unity and shared sacrifice. The neighborhood woke up that morning with a mix of anticipation and pride. The factory, once a symbol of oppression and struggle, was ready for its reopening. Its facade, restored and painted with murals created by the neighbors themselves, depicted figures of hope, unity, and rebirth, the rebirth they had all experienced. The windows gleamed under the sunlight, and the air was filled with the fresh scent of paint and newly cut wood. Elaine walked through the streets still damp with the morning dew, stopping to watch the preparations for the ceremony. Tables were covered with colorful cloths, and food stalls offered traditional dishes cooked by the women of the neighborhood. Larry and Ryan, surrounded by a group of young apprentices, were checking the tools to be displayed as part of the new community workshop. "Look at this, Ryan," a young man exclaimed, holding up a shiny wrench. Ryan smiled, feeling how each small gesture represented a larger change. Sandra, always present with her warm energy, was helping arrange the seating and ensuring that the elderly in the neighborhood had comfortable places to sit. Margot and Carter were overseeing the final touches on the small stage where music and speeches would later take place. "Are you nervous?" Margot asked, lightly touching Carter's arm. He laughed softly and shook his head. "Not as much as the first time I spoke in front of them. Today, I know what we say matters, not just for us." As for Mason, he was at home reviewing his science project one last time. The contest was approaching, and though he had worked tirelessly on his designs, he still felt a knot in his stomach. "Don't worry, son," Elaine said, coming close to look him in the eyes. "Everything you've done, everything you are, is enough. The rest is just the cherry on top." Mason nodded, swallowing his nervousness as his mother's voice filled him with confidence. Together, they headed toward the ceremony, walking through the streets that echoed with laughter and music. The murmur of the crowd grew louder as Finn appeared among them. He wore simple clothes, quite different from the attire he once wore as the factory owner. His transformation was evident, and although some still looked at him with suspicion, others regarded him with a respect earned through hard work and sincere regret. He stopped in front of the stage, looking at Carter, who nodded in greeting. When the ceremony began, Brianna took the microphone first. Her imposing presence and firm voice immediately commanded everyone's attention. "Today is a special day. Today, we celebrate not just the reopening of a factory, but the rebirth of a neighborhood that has learned to fight, fall, and rise stronger. This place will be a symbol of our commitment, of the fact that justice and teamwork are possible when the community comes together," she declared. Her words resonated in the air, and applause erupted like a wave. Elaine was next to speak. Her hands, which had worked tirelessly and now held ink-stained notes, trembled slightly. "This factory was the place where I felt the deepest defeat, but it's also where I found the strength to fight, not just for me, but for Mason, for all the children and families who need a better future," she said, her voice emotional and full of sincerity. Her words brought tears to many, and Mason, from the audience, looked at his mother with pride he could barely contain. Finn stepped forward and took the microphone with firm hands. The silence was nearly palpable. "I have failed, and for that, I ask forgiveness from each of you. But today, alongside you, I promise that this factory will be different. It will be a place where we all have a space, where the voices I once ignored will be the ones to guide our path," he said, his eyes locking with Carter's, who nodded approvingly. As the speeches continued, Ryan moved through the crowd, greeting acquaintances and offering words of encouragement to the young people he had started mentoring. Larry and Sandra, watching him, exchanged a satisfied look. "He's found his path," Sandra whispered, and Larry nodded, feeling a paternal pride for the young man who had left a dark path behind. The festive atmosphere grew as Margot and Carter took the stage and began playing the first notes of a song they had composed together. The music, joyful and rhythmic, drew children and adults alike, who began to move to the beat. The stage turned into a celebration, and for a moment, the weight of past sorrows was left behind. Elaine, from the edge of the crowd, felt a knot in her chest finally loosen. She looked at Mason, who danced and laughed with other children, and thought about everything they had gone through to reach this moment. Brianna approached and touched her shoulder. "Today is a good day," said the lawyer, and Elaine, with tears held back and a wide smile, nodded. "It's the best," she replied. As the sun descended and the sky turned shades of orange and pink, the neighbors began lighting lanterns and candles. The soft, warm glow illuminated the factory's facade, which now carried a commemorative plaque in honor of Finn's late wife, the visionary behind a united community. Carter, emotional, pointed to the plaque as Margot squeezed his hand. "Your mother would be proud," Margot said, and Finn, who had been listening, placed his hand over his chest, closing his eyes for a brief moment of silent gratitude. The night continued with laughter, stories, and toasts. The factory, full of life and hope, became a tangible symbol of what a community can achieve when it decides not to give up. Ryan, with a serene smile, watched the bustle and felt that he had finally found his place. Larry and Sandra embraced, and the cool evening breeze brought them the sound of music and voices laughing. Mason, exhausted but happy, approached Elaine and rested his head in her lap. "Mom, do you think my project could help others like us?" he asked, his voice quiet with sleepiness. Elaine stroked his hair and looked at him with infinite love. "Of course, son, because when we build something with love and dedication, we don't just help others, we leave a legacy that can change everything." Years had passed like leaves blown by the wind, and the neighborhood, once a witness to struggles and falls, had transformed into a vibrant place, full of color and promises fulfilled. The streets, once worn and cracked, now gleamed with murals that told the story of a community that never gave up. Paintings of mothers and fathers working, children playing with broad smiles, and figures of anonymous heroes who had sacrificed everything for a better future decorated the walls. And at the center of it all, proudly standing, was the Technical and Community Studies Center, a modern, bright, and lively building. Elaine, with her hair now graying, reflecting her wisdom and experience, walked slowly toward the community center. The wrinkles on her face were not just marks of time, but of every battle, every tear shed, and every smile earned. Her hands, which had so often carried the weight of the world, now rested calmly, held by the gratitude of a job well done. Around her, she greeted the neighbors who recognized her and greeted her with respect and affection. "Doña Elaine, today's the big day, right?" asked a neighbor with a smile, holding a baby in her arms. Elaine nodded and returned the smile, remembering the days when challenges seemed insurmountable. But today was different. Today, everything she had ever dreamed of was closer to reality than ever. The inauguration event of the community center had gathered the entire neighborhood. Tables were covered with dishes prepared by the neighbors, and the air was filled with laughter, music, and the aroma of spices and sweets. Ryan, who now ran the mechanical and carpentry workshops, moved among a group of teenagers, proudly showing off a bicycle one of them had built from scratch. His eyes, which once reflected the shadow of doubt, now shone with a confidence that inspired the youth to follow his example. Larry, still strong and energetic, oversaw the practical demonstrations alongside Sandra, who, though slower in her movements, still retained the same passion for teaching and motivating. Sandra watched the children and young people running around, laughing and playing, and allowed herself a satisfied sigh. "Look at all this, Larry. It's more than we imagined, don't you think?" she said, resting her head on her life partner's shoulder. Larry nodded, his eyes misted with emotion. More than we imagined, and exactly what we deserved. Margot and Carter, who had become constant and beloved figures in the neighborhood, helped coordinate the event. Carter, with a guitar slung over his shoulder and a smile that had never been so sincere, prepared to play a song written for the occasion. Margot looked at him with tenderness and pride. The connection that had grown between them during those difficult days was now a solid bond, forged in the darkest moments and in the shared triumphs. The murmur of the crowd shifted into an expectant silence when Mason, no longer a child, but a young man with a determined look and a confident posture, approached the microphone. He had returned to the neighborhood after years of studying and working, recognized for his achievements in engineering and philanthropy. However, to him, there was no place more special than the one that had seen him grow. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice clear and strong. "This place is not just a center of studies. It's a reflection of who we are and what we can achieve together. When I was a child, I dreamed of building things that could change the world. But what really changed me was this neighborhood. The people who taught me that the strength of a community can overcome any obstacle," he said, searching the crowd for his mother's eyes. Elaine, with misty eyes, felt time stop. She remembered the long nights of work, the times she had doubted herself, and the small victories that had kept her going. "I told you you'd go far," she whispered to herself as the applause erupted from the crowd and Mason invited her up to the stage. With her heart pounding, Elaine climbed the steps, feeling every gaze full of admiration and gratitude. Mason, standing next to her, handed her an award, a plaque with a simple but powerful inscription. "For your sacrifice and unwavering love, which made everything we are today possible." Elaine read the words, and for the first time in a long while, let the tears fall freely down her face. The crowd stood, and the applause resonated like an echo that spread across the entire neighborhood. Ryan, watching from the back, smiled and felt a deep peace settle in his heart. Larry and Sandra embraced, exchanged a look that said everything that didn't need to be said. Carter and Margot, hand in hand, felt that the path they had walked, though filled with difficulties, had been worth every step. Finn, who had decided to spend his remaining years as a volunteer and teacher at the center, watched with a mix of pride and humility. Redemption had not been easy, but he had dedicated himself to it with the same intensity that once went into his business. He crossed his arms and allowed a sincere smile to cross his face, knowing that his late wife's memory was being honored in every act of kindness and in every young person who found purpose at the center. When the ceremony concluded, laughter and hugs spread through the square. The music started again, this time with Carter playing a lively song while Margot accompanied him singing. Children ran and played, families gathered to share stories, and conversations were filled with plans for the future. Mason approached Ryan and, without a word, hugged him. "Thank you for everything, my friend," he said, and Ryan, with eyes full of emotion, returned the gesture. "You showed us the way, Mason. Keep building, because this neighborhood will never stop dreaming." Elaine, standing in the center of it all, looked around and saw in every face a story of struggle, sacrifice, and triumph. She felt that her heart, which had endured so much, now beat with a peace and pride she never thought possible. As the sun set, bathing the neighborhood in a warm, golden light, she knew that, in the end, everything they had been through had been worth it. The story of the neighborhood, its struggles, and its rebirth is a powerful reflection of universal truths about human resilience and the importance of community. In every chapter of this tale, we see how a person's life is not lived in isolation. It is inextricably woven with the lives of those around them. This story invites us to reflect on the pillars that sustain communities and the sacrifices required to overcome adversity. Elaine embodies love and determination. Her journey, from the unjust accusation and the pain of losing everything to becoming a symbol of hope, teaches us that personal sacrifice is the seed of a larger change. The story reminds us that real heroes don't always wear shiny armor or rise amidst cheers. Often, they are those who work quietly, those who face hopelessness with small and constant gestures, and those whose actions inspire others to do the same. Ryan's role shows us that redemption is possible, even in the darkest moments. In a world where it's easy to judge someone by their mistakes, Ryan's story reminds us that everyone deserves a second chance. His decision to face his own demons and fight for what's right, even at the cost of his safety, is a testament to the fact that the strength of will and the desire for change can transform even the most lost souls. Finn's change, from a symbol of power and selfishness to a humble leader willing to make amends for his mistakes, underscores that regret and action can coexist. Forgiveness and reconciliation, both with oneself and with others, are difficult but necessary steps in building something lasting. This arc of redemption shows us that while past actions may leave scars, a genuine desire to change and contribute can heal both the individual and the community surrounding them. Mason, the boy who dreamed of building a better future, embodies hope and the possibility of a different tomorrow. His growth throughout the story is a reminder that effort and education not only transform individual lives, but have the power to impact entire generations. He is the beacon that guides the neighborhood towards a path of innovation and cooperation, proving that dreams should not just be individual aspirations, but shared goals that strengthen the community. The story also speaks to the importance of human connections. Margot and Carter teach us that understanding and empathy can unite people from different backgrounds and struggles, and that love and passion for a shared purpose can clear paths that seemed impossible. Larry and Sandra represent unconditional support, the figures who hold others up in their lowest moments, reminding us that strong bonds are forged not only in blood, but in solidarity and selfless acts. Brianna, the lawyer fighting for justice, reminds us that the fight for rights and equity is neither easy nor quick, but it is necessary. She symbolizes those who, with determination and knowledge, choose to serve causes that go beyond their own needs, defending those who have no voice or strength to do so for themselves. The narrative of the neighborhood is a reminder that, although difficulties and injustices may strike us time and again, true strength lies in the ability to rise. It's proof that communities can rise from the ashes of despair, stronger and more united. It's the demonstration that change begins with a spark, whether it's the bravery of a mother like Elaine, the sacrifice of a young man like Ryan, or the determination of a group of people who decide they will no longer be victims of circumstances, but authors of their own destiny. The story of the neighborhood is the story of all of us. It's a call to recognize the everyday struggles, to value the hands that reach out in help, and to never underestimate the power of community. It teaches us that the darkest moments are often the precursors to the brightest and most lasting transformations. And most of all, it reminds us that when a community unites and decides that no challenge is insurmountable, the impossible becomes possible. The legacy of the neighborhood is a legacy of struggle, redemption, and the reminder that shared dreams are not only achieved, but they endure and multiply. And so we come to the end of this episode, where we explored a story of struggle, hope, and redemption that reminds us of the power of community and the strength of the human spirit. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey and for being part of this corner where we share stories that inspire, teach, and move us. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Remember, we are all part of something greater, and just like in the neighborhood of Elaine and Mason, together we can overcome any challenge. See you in the next chapter, and never forget, shared dreams are the ones that change the world. Until next time.